Welcome back to biological or physical anthropology. This lesson is about the forces of evolution. These are also called mechanisms of evolution or factors of evolution. We're learning about how evolution occurs. So we will start off with a little bit of population genetics. We discussed this in lesson 3, and we will talk about some different scales or levels of evolution, and then on to the forces or functions of evolution. You've already learned about one, which is natural selection. We're going to move on to mutation, genetic drift, and gene flow. Review those and talk about this week's video. So in Module 2, we looked at the history of scientific thought that led to Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. In Module 3, we examined the inner workings of the cell and how DNA replicates itself and codes for making proteins. It's time to merge these ideas. If natural selection leads to the survival and reproduction of individuals with traits best fit for an environment, and if these traits are caused by underlying differences in the genes, then evolution can be studied by looking at the gene frequencies themselves. If these gene frequencies change, then evolution must be occurring. In this lesson, we will explore inheritance, species, and forces or causes of evolution. This approach, called population genetics, examines how gene frequencies vary from one population to another and how gene frequencies change within a population over time. So the big question we will address in this week is, what causes evolutionary or genetic change? For example, how did changes in genes and natural selection combine to form organisms so amazingly adapted for their environment as this leafy sea dragon? Here is the sea dragon. So here is one case study that we're going to look at it as resistance to malaria. And the story starts with a medical student in the 1940s who was raised in Kenya and studied at Oxford University. He studied blood groups and genetic traits and discovered that in areas affected by malaria, a remarkably high 20 to 30% of the population carried the gene for sickle cell anemia. He hypothesized that individuals with a sickle cell allele were resistant to malaria and that natural selection was operating on the gene. But how? Remember that an allele is just a different version of a gene, so it's an altered form of the normal gene. He researched this relationship and published his work showing that gene frequencies are tied to natural selection in human populations. The carrier of the sickle cell allele survive longer and produce more offspring than non-carriers due to this factor of malaria. Don't forget, when we looked at natural selection, we were looking at environmental factors. One of the common examples that I'll show you in this slide and that we saw in the natural selection slide was the crows or the birds. That bird was a factor. Here, an environmental factor. Here, malaria is an environmental factor. So, human populations exhibit some remarkable biological differences, and the science of genetics helps biologists answer questions about those differences. Many times the differences are due to different environments and natural selection that has shaped our evolution over time. So, the questions and answers are founded on Darwin's discovery that phenotypes, the traits expressed by our genes, change over time. Mendel's research on garden peas revealed how the inheritance of genes produces variation in phenotypes. We will examine further these questions of genes and natural selection, but first we need to look a little further at species concepts and population genetics. So we're going to do some terms and vocabulary here for a minute. Edeme. Edeme, I don't use this term very often in this class, but it's a local population that interbreeds, so you could use that interchangeably with population. A gene pool is all the genetic information in a breeding population, so all the genes in edeme is the gene pool. Reproductive isolation is a mechanism that prevents two populations from interbreeding. We often think of this as geography, perhaps one species is on an island, or one population is on an island and one isn't, or there's a mountain range or a river or something like that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical barrier. Reproductive isolation is just any mechanism that prevents two populations from interbreeding. A species is a group of reproductively isolated organisms, and we are going to discuss a little bit more species concepts, so how to define a species. So keep that in mind. The what is a species is kind of, I wouldn't say it's up for debate, but it's something we need to look into. What defines a species? Continuing on with important concepts in population genetics. So the concept of the breeding population, or the deme, is central to the definition of species. A species is comprised of all of the populations and their individual members that are capable of breeding with each other and producing viable, fertile offspring. So that is important. If there's some sort of hybrid between two populations that is not fertile, that means that they are not, reproductively compatible, because those genes can no longer be passed on. So if two individuals in a group can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, they are members of the same species. So the concept of the species is dependent on or defined by the basis of reproductive isolation. So if they're not reproductively isolated, if they can reproduce and produce fertile offspring, they are belonging to the same species. So here's an example of ostriches and emus who had a common ancestor, but were separated by geographic isolation and evolving separately on different continents. That's an example, just one example of reproductive isolation. Though the emu and the ostrich share a common ancestor, they can no longer interbreed with one another, in part because they are separated by a considerable distance. This is an example of how reproductive isolation can sometimes happen, because two populations simply do not encounter one another in the wild because of some geographical barrier, like a mountain range or a large body of water. This can over time result in the accumulation of enough genetic differences that even if the two populations became reunited, they would not recognize one another as mates, or they just wouldn't be genetically compatible. This is one of the major factors in causing new species to evolve. In the wild, we can easily observe whether or not reproductive isolation has occurred. This becomes more difficult with fossils. We have to rely on the assumption that if two fossils have similar enough phenotypes, or shapes of the bones, phenotype, don't forget, is the external kind of expression of a gene. An example could be tooth shape or morphology. Skeletal morphology basically means shape of the bones. So if their bones are similar, have the same shapes, they must have been sharing genes and therefore could interbreed. So again, I was mentioning that we need to pay attention to species concepts. It's very difficult to tell species from other species when you're having fossils that are shaped similarly. How much of a difference constitutes a species difference? That can be difficult to tell. If there are substantial differences in anatomy, then perhaps the fossil species are reproductively isolated and represent different species. Sometimes it's quite easy to determine from the fossil record the modern species of the fossil that the fossil most resembles, as shown here in the case of horseshoe crabs, cockroaches, and opossums. So let's look. We have these quote-unquote living fossils. It doesn't mean that they're actually living fossils, but there are cases, of course, when the morphology, the shape of the animal, doesn't change over time. This doesn't mean that it wasn't evolving. The genes are going to be very different. What we're looking at is an external representation and just some features of the animal's whole genome. So evolution works to maintain similarity as well. Stasis, evolution balances, so it can keep the shape of an animal or organism, the morphology, what we might see as a fossil later on. They can keep that constant. So just because we're seeing animals that haven't changed or appear to have not changed, evolution has been working on them just as long as any other species that might have changed. That's important to remember. So the fact that we're seeing fossils looking the same after all that time, imagine all of the mutations that could have occurred over millions of years and now had been weeded out basically because of natural selection likely or other forces of evolution to keep these forms the same because they work for a reason. Okay, I'm probably going to repeat a little bit of what I just said here. These living fossils closely resemble the modern form, demonstrating that natural selection has favored these anatomies over a long period of time. However, many fossils look quite different from their modern descendants, making it difficult to discern relationships. Complicating matters even further is that many fossils represent dead-end lineages that did not leave any modern descendants. Sorting this out is difficult and will be looked at again in later chapters. So it's important to remember that most of the species on Earth that have ever existed are now extinct. It's another fun fact for you. All right, we're going to look at two different types of evolution. They operate on the same principles. There's just a difference in time scale. Macroevolution and microevolution. And we are almost to the end of this part of the lesson. So I'm going to show you a picture of each of these concepts, and then we'll move on to part 2 of this forces of evolution lesson. So here demonstrates two different examples of evolution. Microevolution, occurring here with the bugs or beetles over one generation, and macroevolution, occurring over millions of years. So let's look 60 million years ago at the Eohippus. So 60 million years ago, mammals were just kind of not quite just getting their start, but it was earlier on in mammal evolution. And 60 million years ago would have been not long after the dinosaurs went extinct. This extinction opened up brand new ecological niches for mammals to fill in. So we're seeing an early example of a mammal in this Eohippus. Over time, climate changes and the evolution of grasses would have changed how the Eohippus evolved and adapted to its environment. Colder periods would have a larger body type would have been favored in colder environments, and the emergence of the grasslands might have led also to different adaptations in the teeth and the feet. And we can see how there are less toes in this modern horse over time, and the increase in size. So lots of things are happening with the horse over millions of years. That's an example of macroevolution, basically. Okay, this is the end of this part of the lesson. Please move on to part 2.